Welcome to Coach Bennett's podcast, where every run has a purpose, where kindness is hardcore, where this is about running, and this is not about running, where every starting line is a finish line in disguise, where rambling still gets you where you need to be, where pineapple will never ruin your pizza, and the sodas, adult and not adult kind, are always cold, and where there is room on the starting line for everybody. I'm Coach Bennett. Thank you for letting me be a part of your day. Let's get started. Welcome to episode 55 of Coach Bennett's podcast. That's right, 55. And let me tell you this, not only is this a special episode because it's 55 and 55 sounds cool and it's 5-5 and all that stuff. I mean, that's as special as it gets, right? But it's also special because we just hit our year anniversary. June 16th, which was just a couple days ago, was the 1 year anniversary of Coach Bennett's podcast coming out. That's right. So technically we had 54 episodes come out in our first year. There were two kind of special episodes that came out. And how exciting is that? 1 year. So let me start by saying to everyone, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for being a part of this community. Thank you for sending mail into the mailbox. Yes, the mailbag will be open today. Thank you for just making this a possibility, because without you, it's not happening. I'm making this podcast for all of you. I'm making this podcast for all of us. So thank you so much. I just wanted to start by saying happy birthday to Coach Bennett's podcast, which really is my way of saying thank you to all of you. So let's start episode 55, which is entitled Finding Your Pace. Now, what is this about? It's going to be about finding your pace. Now, if I was putting together a list of the top questions that I get asked, those questions I get asked repeatedly, over and over again, by athletes, by runners. And let's say I whittled that list down to 10, the top 10 questions I get asked. Questions about finding your pace is going to be in there. And it's not just long run pace or easy run pace. It's all the paces. It's how do I find my 5K pace, my 10K pace, my mile pace, my fast, my hard, my easy, however you want to describe it. That's how it gets asked. So it's just questions about finding your pace, even though it might get asked 25 different ways because people are asking about race paces, or they're asking about the difference between hard and easy and how to tell the difference, or should they be adjusting their pace and by how much on an easy run or a long run, and what is a tempo run? All of this stuff. It's complicated, right? Not really. Like I said, running's not complicated. Runners are complicated. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to crack this nut about paces, what it means, and how best to find your own paces. So let's start this. And by the way, you may know what your paces are, what your efforts are, what your speeds are. This is going to be a good thing to listen to, I think. The best lessons are best learned more than once. And that's really what teaching is. That's what coaching is. It's a lot of repetition. It's a lot of redundancies. It's a lot of explaining things in different ways. The end result isn't different, but maybe how we get there is. I mean, I like to look at it this way, like the number 5. It's 2 plus 3, right? Of course it is. It's also 4 plus 1. It's also 7 minus 2. It's also 25 divided by 5. There's a lot of ways to get to 5. And that's how I look at teaching, and that's how I look at coaching. There are a lot of answers. There's a lot of different ways to get to them. And it's important to understand that. So when we're talking about paces, I think maybe that's the first thing maybe for us to cover, is that there's a lot of different ways to look at paces. Like, what does it mean? Well, for me, paces mean a couple of different things. One, they represent efforts. They represent efforts, and they represent your efforts. So maybe if I rewind a little bit, I should start by saying this. Your paces are your paces. Your efforts are your efforts. The paces associated with your efforts and the efforts associated with your paces are yours. You have to own them. They're not your friend Sally's. They're not your friend Jimmy's. They're yours. When you're running with a group, not everyone's at the exact same fitness level. Maybe you have the luxury of running with people that are around the same fitness level, like close, nearby, neighbors, but you're not the exact same. And you have different strengths and weaknesses. So the first thing you need to do when you're talking about finding your pace, finding your paces, is you have to focus on that word your. You got to own it, which means you got to own your fitness to begin with. Now, what does that mean? It means who you are today is what matters. From a coaching perspective, people love to tell me who they were or who they want to be. I love hearing about that. But the most important version of you is this version of you, the one with me today, the one talking to me today, the one telling me about who they were, the one telling me about who they want to be. That's the athlete I get to work with. That's the person I'm going to get to the starting line with, cross that starting line with, work to the finish line with, and then talk about what we can do next. You, the person you are today, here and now, that's the most important version of you of all. We can get very romantic about who we were, and we can get very inspired about who we might be. But the person you are today is the most important version of you. So when I say you got to own your fitness, I'm talking about own your fitness today for this run. Don't start bringing in fitness from 6 months ago, 6 years ago, or 6 years from now. Focus on today. So when you're owning your fitness, you're owning your current fitness. And by owning it, that also means you're embracing it. You're not beating yourself up about the fitness that you're in today. Okay? That happens too. And usually what happens is you start running someone else's paces, using someone else's speeds, someone else's efforts. And by someone else, that someone else could have been someone you once were or someone you are not yet. That is not you. It's a different version of you. So when I say don't run other people's races, don't run other people's paces, and don't own other people's fitnesses, I'm not just talking about other people, meaning Sally and Jimmy. I'm also talking about other versions of you. All right? So that's kind of the baseline we have to have if we're going to have this conversation. You have to own who you are today. And this is about running. This is also not about running. This is the magic ingredient for everything. If you want to achieve anything, you got to work with the person you are. And yes, in the future, you'll be somebody else. And when that future, you get caught up to it and it becomes the present, that's who you're working with. But we're not there yet. We're here today. So just wanted to get that out of the way. If you're going to find your pace, it's going to be your pace today with your fitness today, who you are now. All right, next, there are different paces. There are different efforts, and there are different purposes. And when you work amongst that knowledge, you suddenly realize, okay, not everything is the same, which is really cool, because what that means is you have different paces inside you. You have different efforts you can give, and you have different purposes of which to run. And by purposes, I mean a couple things. I could mean you're going for an easy run, or we're doing a really, really hard workout. Those are different purposes, which means you're going to have different efforts, which means you're going to have different paces. But the other thing is running 5K pace is a different purpose. You're trying to run as well as you can, as efficiently as you can, as fast as you can for 5,000 meters. That's a different purpose than, let's say, 10K pace, which would be running as best as you can for 10,000 meters, which is a different effort than running as fast as you can for 1,500 meters or a mile. They're different efforts. So you could say, hey, listen, we're going to run 100 meters as fast as we can. That's an extreme effort. And the more extreme the effort, the shorter amount of time you can do it. But that's also not totally true, right? It's an extreme effort, which means your greatest speed, your most intensity for the shortest amount of time is married to the shortest distance that you can run, right? So you can run 100 meters at, let's say, your 10 out of 10 effort, as fast as you can go. Anything beyond that, it gets really, really hard. You can't maintain that 100-meter pace for 200 meters because you can't. That's your 100-meter pace. Anything beyond that, you just slow down, which means you've got to back off a little bit in terms of the speed, in terms of the effort, but the intensity is there once you get close to 200 meters being done, right? Like I always tell people, 5K pace isn't hard to do unless you're trying to do it for 5,000 meters. Doing 5K pace for 100 meters isn't hard. Doing 100 meter pace for 100 meters is really hard. Doing marathon pace is a joke unless you're trying to run a marathon. And then it's really hard. It's very hard to do. It's not very hard to do the first couple of minutes. It's not very hard to do the first couple of miles. But I'll tell you what, it gets really, really intense. Even though you're not running anywhere close to the speed that you can run 100 meters, that pace becomes really, really difficult. That marathon, 42.2K pace, becomes really difficult as you're at 40K. Because there's a lot of factors that go into it. There's fatigue. There's endurance. There's all sorts of things. It's suddenly you're pushing different things because it's a different purpose. It's associated with a different effort, and it's associated with a different pace. So my point is the mentality associated with different paces, the personality associated with different paces, the level of intensity associated with different paces marries into the purpose of those paces. So you're going to have a much different personality, let's say. You're a much different runner, okay, when you're trying to run 42.2K as opposed to when you're going out and trying to run a 200. That's another thing I want you to remember. You have all of these different types of runners inside you. You have that 100-meter runner, and you've got that 42.2K runner. And some of you are totally weird, and you've got the 50K and 100K and 100-mile version runners inside you. But we'll talk about the ultra weirdos another time. We love you. You're definitely weird, and I mean that in the best possible way. So already we've got some foundational things that we've covered, right? If we're going to find our pace, we need to own our fitness. If we're going to find our pace, we need to own who we are right now. If we're going to find our pace, we have to understand that there are different paces because there are different efforts, there are different purposes. Now we can go even a little bit more specific and break down where those different paces, different efforts, and different purposes show up, right? And they show up in the different types of runs that we do. They show up in the easy runs or the recovery runs. They show up in the long runs. They show up in the tempo runs, the fartlek runs, the intervals, and the different type of intervals that we're doing. Long intervals or short intervals, or intervals that are based on efforts like 7 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 effort, or efforts that are based on race paces. Like we're going to do 400 meters at your 5K pace, then we're going to do an 800 at your 10K pace, and we're going to close out with 4x200 at your mile pace. These are different ways of looking at the paces, right? We're breaking them down, associating them with the type of run that we're doing. A speed run, a recovery run, a long run, or even breaking it down even further. An easy run, but it's the warm-up, which is going to be an even easier version of an easy run, or the cool down. Same premise. Or an easy run after a race, an easy run before a race. Or is this a recovery run that's midweek and you can actually run a little bit quicker than you would on, let's say, a warm-up, a cool down, or an easy or recovery run the day before a race or the day after a race. There's all sorts of things that are going to change the pace a little bit, which is why every time you're talking about someone's pace, could be your own pace, there's a range. There's a range. There's kind of the middle ground. We'll just pretend we're going for an easy run and we're going to go for 5K. And on average, you're shooting for 6-minute K. So it's going to take you 30 minutes to run 5K. Now, the success or failure is not going to be based on whether or not you nail 30 minutes for 5K. You just know, on average, right now, based on your fitness, all things being the same, it takes you about 30 minutes to run a recovery run 5K, 6-minute Ks. And you're taking into account the fact that you're going to start a little bit easier, which means slower. You're going to ease into the run. You're going to progress into that pace. And over the last K or two, you may even be running a little bit quicker than the average pace, those 6-minute Ks. So by the end of the run, you've averaged around 6-minute Ks. But it's around 6-minute Ks. And that's if everything is basically average. The terrain, the weather, how you're feeling. Because if you're an advanced runner And everyone can be an advanced runner because it has nothing to do with pace or speed. It has to do with intellect. It has to do with wisdom. Everyone can be an advanced runner. The point is, you know that the terrain, the weather, and how you're feeling all have their say when it comes to what are we running today? What kind of pace are we running? Are we going to be averaging 6-minute Ks on this recovery run? Well, the terrain's really hilly. It's rolling up and down some gnarly trails. So no, it's going to be slower because we have to take into account the terrain, don't we? Okay. What else? Well, the weather. The weather has a say too. So maybe we're not on trails. Maybe we're on the roads and everything's great, except for the fact that it's unbelievably windy and very cold. Well, that's going to have an effect on the pace as well. How are you feeling? Let's say the weather's fine. The terrain is fine, but you're exhausted. You're stressed out from some rough days at school. That's going to have an effect on the pace as well. So this is another thing that you just have to factor in as you're thinking about, okay, I'm looking for my pace. I'm trying to find my pace. You got to own your fitness. Got to own who you are today. You got to understand that there are different paces, different efforts, different purposes. You got to understand when it comes to pace, there are different types of runs: easy runs, hard runs, tempo runs, fartlek runs, interval runs, long runs, and things like terrain, weather, life all play a part in what those paces are. So at this point in the episode, it's just good to know that you're always looking at a pace and some gray area. And if you're new to running, or if you're coming back to running, you're starting over, starting again, it doesn't really matter at all. It really is just based on effort and no numbers. You're going out there on an easy run and you just want to run easy. And after you build up a big enough sample size, which means enough runs over a period of time, let's say 2 weeks, 10 days to 2 weeks of runs, you can look and say, what am I averaging roughly on these recovery runs that I'm doing, on these easy runs? Oh, look, I'm averaging around 6-minute Ks. Great. Let's pay attention to that, but let's still focus on our effort and let the pace follow, because then you're going to find that gray area. And that gray area, as you get fitter, this is one of the fun things that people don't really focus on enough, is that pace is going to get quicker. You're going to be able to run easy, but run faster. Your pace is going to get better, and you're going to maintain the same effort. That's called progression. And it's an important thing to look at, which is also why I tell people, get a running log. Write in a running log. Keep a running journal. And don't just write the numbers. Write the efforts. Write the purposes. Write how you felt. Write how the run went. So you can look back and say, you know what? I find myself running these numbers, these paces, for these distances, over these durations, numbers. But the real important thing, the heart and the soul of the running log, is how you felt. Felt great. Super easy run. Look at these times. Wow. Kept it easy. Kept it in control. Compared to 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, I'm running further. I'm running faster. I'm running easier. That's progression. You need a running log. Most of the people that ask me about their paces, how to find them, how do I figure out what my easy run pace is, how do I find out what my long run pace is, how do I find out what paces I'm supposed to run on my intervals, they don't keep running logs. They don't keep them. And your running log is like a map, all right? It is. And you're going to go in there and you're going to find a whole bunch of X's. Oh, X marks the spot, that's my 5K pace. X marks my spot, that's my new easy run pace. Look at that. In the last 6 weeks, it's improved 5, 7, 10 seconds per K. I'm running further. I'm running faster. I'm running easier. I'm getting fitter. You're going to find that in your running log. You're also going to see where maybe there were some missteps. Maybe you pushed too far, too fast, too soon. You'll see those easy runs are getting faster. You're going further, but you're working harder. And sometimes we don't catch it, even though we write it. We don't see it, even though we experienced it, until we look back and we have to actually reread and relive what we did. And suddenly it's, oof, I went from running roughly 6-minute Ks to suddenly 5:40 Ks. That was probably too big of a jump. Or I'm wondering why I'm starting to struggle, why my paces don't make any sense. And maybe we think the training is gone awry. And that's not the case, because what you've also written in your running log is a little bit about your life. And you realize, you know what? We had exams. I had a breakup. I had some arguments at home. I've been dealing with a lot. I'm tired. And I'm bringing that into my running. And I'm not adjusting my running, my paces, my efforts like I should. So as a result, instead of running the right paces with the right efforts, I'm running the wrong paces and giving the wrong efforts, and I'm getting more and more tired. That's why you need a running log, okay? It's going to help you be a better coach, because what that running log is going to do is give you insights into the athlete, you, and it's going to help you adjust those paces faster or slower, or confirm, which means maintain for now. All right? So make sure you're keeping a running log and make sure you're writing about more than the numbers. The other thing, which is important, is all of these paces, which again are representative of different efforts, which are really representations of the different purposes, meaning the types of runs that we're doing. We also have different strengths and weaknesses. So for instance, when I was running in college, I was pretty mentally weak. So longer runs were hard for me, even though maybe physically I was capable of doing them. They became very difficult because mentally I would get burnt out. Physically I was fine. Mentally I was getting tired. Physically I was okay. Mentally I was starting to panic. Physically, no problems. Mentally I was quitting. And that was showing up in my paces. And because at the time I wasn't mature enough to see this, that my long runs were really more of a product of me being mentally weak than physically weak, I was associating this with just poor running. And I would try to mitigate these mental weaknesses with more running, which led to more weaknesses. So the other thing that you want to do when you're looking at your paces, I would ask some tough questions. If you see that you're much better at running shorter, faster things, and those paces don't seem to correlate well with the longer stuff, well, maybe it's because you're a little weaker at the longer stuff. And it could be physical. It could be mindful. It could be vice versa, where you're much better at the longer intervals, and then when you have to step down and run faster paces, those 8 and 9 out of 10 efforts, that mile pace stuff, the really quick, short turnover stuff, okay, that nasty speed type stuff. Well, if there's issues, well then maybe physically or mentally, mindfully, you're not prepared to do those as well. We all are going to have imbalances. We're going to have them. Strengths and weaknesses. The key is to not be afraid of those weaknesses. The key is to embrace those weaknesses and be willing, be excited really, to work on those weaknesses. That's part of finding your pace. It's having hard discussions, conversations with yourself. If you find that there's a certain point in easy runs where suddenly the easy run gets difficult and you just kind of fall apart and it doesn't feel like it's physical, well, maybe it's the mindful side of the endurance it takes mindfully to go for a longer recovery run or a longer long run. Maybe it's the fact that you find yourself getting bored or losing focus. It's not always the physical side, but it could be the physical side. I had an athlete once that looked totally fine. Breathing was fine. Never really had many issues until about 2/3 of the way into our runs. And then suddenly it was weird. He would just fall off. And he said he just felt like he had to work really hard to stay up, even though from a cardio point of view, everything was fine. And it was really hard to figure out. So I decided I'm just going to watch. And what I realized was later into the run, his knee lift would start to just diminish. And he was taking more strides because he was taking shorter strides. And what I realized was, his hip flexors are really, really weak. So they would get fatigued. Now that hip flexor helps lift up your leg. So what would happen is his knee drive would diminish, which led to his stride length diminishing, which meant that he was taking more strides, which meant he was working harder to covering the same distance at the end of the run compared to the beginning of the run. So it was a simple fix. Let's strengthen your hip flexors. No joke, within a week, things were great. Now, it's not always a simple fix like that, but it wasn't a simple fix to begin with. We were thinking like, oh, maybe he's out of shape. Maybe it's a lack of endurance. No, it was just weak hip flexors. So you have to be willing to look at yourself critically to build up, not critically to beat down when you're looking for your paces or trying to understand why certain paces you're stronger than other paces or weaker at certain paces than other paces. Because remember, and sometimes this helps, I think. Some people aren't comfortable kind of looking at it that point of view. Like, I want to find like why this pace is weak and this pace is strong. You can plug the word pace right out of there and put in effort. Like, why are certain efforts easier than others for me? Or purposes. Why are certain purposes easier than others for me? That was something that really helped me. And towards the end of my competitive running career, I was fascinated by my weaknesses, and I was engaged with them, and it excited me to work on those. And I actually wish I had realized that a little bit earlier, but when I was a coach, that was something that I celebrated. When athletes were willing to acknowledge and work on their weaknesses, it was celebrated. That was how we were going to get better, really, really better. If we're just focusing on our strengths, our upsides, well, we're closer to our ceilings with our strengths. I like the fact when we're like in the basement, we're in the gutter with our weaknesses. All right, we got a long way to go till we reach the ceiling, the top of the mountain. You know what I'm talking about? So let's get excited about those weaknesses because they're the easiest things to improve and they offer the most improvement. Okay, another thing to think about as we're trying to find our pace is that paces change because of changes in places and headspaces and faces and races. It's an important thing to remember. It would be nice to believe that like our paces don't change. Actually, I don't know if it would be nice because then there's no upside, there's no downside, there's no risk, there's no reward. It is what it is. There's no progression. Are we improving? And there is something even about like when you start out, and you think like, geez, I'm in such terrible shape. There's something glorious about being like, I'm at rock bottom. Like this is it. This run is going to help dramatically, even though it's a very short run at an easy effort at a pace that at most points in my life I would frown upon, even though I shouldn't frown upon because I got to own my fitness. My point is, it's important to know that paces are going to change. And what I said was paces change because of changes in places and headspaces and faces and races. And what I mean by that, where you're at can change your pace. You could be at 10,000 feet elevation. You could be at sea level. You could be in the middle of a forest on a gnarly trail. You could be running around a track. You could be running on a boardwalk. You could be running in Central Park. There's lots of different places, and those places are going to change your paces. Headspaces can change your paces depending on where you're at. If you're dealing with a lot of stress in your life, it's going to have an effect on your paces. It's also going to have an effect on your recovery. So red flag, make sure if you're in a bad headspace, make sure you're taking care of yourself and adjusting those paces. The faces around you are going to change your paces, who you're running with. It's important to remember who you're running with is going to change your paces. That's just how it is. There are some people where, for whatever reason, conversation is unbelievable and the pace just kind of takes care of itself. There are other people where it's a little bit more serious, it's a little bit more focused, maybe it's even a little bit more boring, and you're going to be focusing on the pace a little bit more than you were with the wild and crazy laughing crowd. That's important. 30 minutes where you have to focus on the pace, an easy run pace, is different than 30 minutes with 3 or 4 people where you're talking and laughing the whole time. It's different. It's a different effort associated with the same pace. One of my favorite runs I ever went on was the high school team I was coaching. This was a while ago. This is maybe like 15 years ago. 15 or 16 years ago now that I think about it. And we did an 8-mile run, okay? Which is, 12K plus. And at the end of it, I remember talking to the kids like, wait, we're done? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, that went so fast. That's crazy. And we were all kind of laughing. The conversation was so good. It didn't have a negative effect on the pace. The point is, it just flew by. It just flew by. It wasn't one of those runs where you're literally living every second and every stride. And I've had that. Sometimes when I'm not sharing a run with any faces, I'm doing it solo, the run just seemingly takes forever. Even though it's an easy effort, even though it's a pace that is not that fast, it just seems tougher. It just seems tougher. That pace is not the same because there are those faces that made the run go by so quickly, they weren't there. And then races. Okay, the paces change with the races, and that's an important thing to remember. A 5K is not a 10K. A 10K is not a 21.1K, and a 21.1K is not a 42.2K. They are different races. The paces change with them. It doesn't mean there's going to be some crossover sometimes, and you're picking things up at the end, and suddenly it's like, oh my goodness, I ended my half marathon at my mile pace for the last 400 meters. That's going to happen. The point is that over the course of these races, the paces change, which means the efforts associated with that, for the most part, are going to change, especially when you're breaking it down in your training into smaller and smaller chunks. The mentality changes. All of these things you want to work on, and you want to become all of those different runners associated with those different races that bring out those different personalities inside of you. So remember, the paces change because of changes in places and headspaces and faces and races, okay? Now, the podcast so far has been all of this kind of just foundational core stuff that I think is really important. Now, the nuts and bolts about how you find your paces, there's a couple of ways of doing that. One is going to be consistent running, all right? You're not going to find paces that you can rely on if you're running inconsistently. That's just the truth, okay? So if you're running once a week, it's going to be hard to find what your actual pace is. If you're running consistently a couple times a week, every single week, you're going to not only find those paces, but you're going to have more confidence in those paces. More often than not, they are going to represent those efforts and those purposes. So if you are running consistently, what you're going to see is you've got a better handle on what you should be running for your easy runs. Racing is another great way of finding what those paces should be around. All right. So if you go out and you run a 5K, and let's just use the example of, 90-second quarters gets you to 18:45 for 5K. There is a recovery run pace that is loosely associated with someone that can run 18:45 for 5K. There's also all things being the same, someone that can run 18:45 for 5K would probably be able to run around this time for a mile or around this time for 10K if they had the equivalent fitness and endurance they've got for the 5K for the 10K. There is a pace chart that you can find in the NRC app in the training plans. Those are just good starting points. So if you say, oh, I just ran a 10K and I ran 55 minutes for 10K, okay, according to this chart, roughly my recovery runs should be around this. You don't focus on those numbers right off the bat. You start running consistently and see if they match up, roughly match up. If they're way, way off, that's where you go back to that conversation with yourself and say, what are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? It could be that you're running way faster for your recovery runs than you should be, or maybe what the recovery runs are telling you is that you should be running way faster in that 10K. That's where you have to have that conversation with yourself. Everything's not going to be perfect. It's not always going to line up because, like I said, there are going to be imbalances. We are going to have strengths and weaknesses. But if you're running consistently, if you're racing every once in a while, and you can just do a race like a time trial, what you want to do is just be paying attention and adjusting accordingly and looking for those imbalances, looking for those weaknesses, and also celebrating and working on those strengths. Okay? You want to do that in tandem with the other stuff. But that's the best way of doing it. A lot of people will say, it's hard for me to find my pace. Okay, well, Are you consistently running? Are you consistently keeping a running log? Are you mixing up and having a diverse training schedule so you can actually be going out and testing what 5K pace is, 10K pace, or a 6 out of 10 effort and an 8 out of 10 effort? Are you writing in that running log about how the easy runs are going? Are you noticing maybe weaknesses when you go on a long run where you're starting to struggle maybe from a cardio perspective, or maybe you're starting to struggle lower body where your quads are starting to get tired, or you feel like your knee lift is dragging, or maybe you've got way more energy than you think you should at the end of a long run, or maybe you're not having any energy at all. Could it be the fact that those paces are not getting screwed up so much with the pacing of your run, but how you're setting your run up? Are you drinking enough? Are you eating enough? Are you sleeping enough? Are you recovering enough? Are you being a good teammate upstairs with that self-talk? These are the types of things that are going to help you find your pace. So I know at the very, very beginning, I said finding your pace isn't complicated because running isn't complicated. Runners are complicated. I guess this is where we're getting full circle again. And I'm saying, yeah, it might be complicated to find your pace, but that's just because you're complicated. And that's not a bad thing. You're not simple. You're a complicated machine. So what you have to do is be having those conversations with yourself, keep that running log, having a diverse training schedule, making sure that you're taking into account the differences that terrain, weather, life, and fitness cause. Owning that fitness of yours. Who you are as an athlete, who you are as a person. Knowing the different runs that you have different efforts and different purposes associated with it. Being okay to adjust faster and slower based on your fitness progression, based on how your life is going, based on the purpose of the run. Not diminishing your strengths and not ignoring your weaknesses, and knowing the paces change because of changes in places and headspaces and faces and races. And that's how you find your pace. But that's not the end of episode 55. No, we've got a mindset minute and a mailbag. That's right. We've got both. So let's open up the mailbag, and then we'll bring in mindset coach extraordinaire, Tammy Bennett. But before that, okay, this is a letter from Noah from Philly that says, "Dear Coach Bennett, something happened to me recently that happens every now and then on long runs, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. My plan was to do about 8 easy miles in and out and back. I made it to the turnaround and kept going until almost 5 miles total, and I completely ran out of steam. My legs were fine. I didn't feel any pain. I was hydrating along the way. I ate a gel at 45 minutes in. My breathing was fine. I just felt like I couldn't keep running. The specific issue might have been that I hadn't eaten much that day or the day before, but regardless, I hit a mental wall and still had to walk 3 miles home. Should I have tried to push through and use those remaining 3 miles for as much training as I could? Thanks, Noah from Philly." All right, well, first, I'm going to make an assumption here, and assumptions are always dangerous, but you gave me some information here and said it could be the fact that you didn't eat much that day and you didn't eat much the day before. So let's just first say there's a good chance that's what it is. You ran out of gas. You need to fuel. And it's not about fueling day of. It's about being fueled the day of, which means you got to be fueled the day before, and you got to be fueled the day before that. It's consistent fueling, which you need, okay? There's a really good chance that was the problem. Let's pretend it's not a fueling issue. One thing that I would imagine it could be is a case of overwhelm, all right? You got to 4 miles. It's time to turn around. You've completed 6.5K, all right? And suddenly the idea of another 6.5K, it's just too much. It's overwhelming. And it's not about the next mile. It's not about doing 2 miles more. It's about, oh my God, I've got 4 more miles to go and I can't do it. And suddenly the weight of 4 miles becomes incredibly heavy. So heavy, you can't run with that weight anymore. You got to stop. And I'm making this assumption that it's that because I've lived that. I've had athletes that have lived that. That is incredibly common. It's just overwhelming how much running you've got left to do. Now, the good thing here is that's not a physical thing. That's a mental thing. The hard part here is it's not a physical thing. It's a mental thing. So there's good and there's bad with that, right? Okay, either way, it's a problem that we can solve. And there's a couple of different ways to solve it, I think. Here's a couple things that I would recommend you try. The next time you do an 8-mile run, I want you to break it down in your head a little differently. I don't want you to think of an 8-mile run. I want you to think of it this way. You've got a 2-mile warm-up, and I really want you to think of it as a warm-up. I want you to have a warm-up mentality, which is just very relaxed, very chill, 2 miles. So you got a little over 3K, where your only focus is to ease into this run. Allow yourself to be sluggish. Allow your mind to drift, because all you're doing is warming up. You're giving your body 3.2K to just warm up from not running to running. Then I want you to think about a 4-mile run. I'm going on a 4-mile run. The 2-mile warm-up's done. Okay? It doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. It's out of there. You're just going for a 4-mile run. I want you to think of a brand new, fresh 4-mile run. That's what you're doing. You're running 4 miles. You can break it up into quarters. First mile, easing into it. Second mile, find a rhythm. Third mile, stay focused. Third mile, stay focused. Fourth mile, make sure we finish this out. Eyes up, run ahead. Then, when you're done, what I want you to do is take a minute. Stop. Walk for a minute. Do whatever you want to do. Get your hands on your head. Have a drink. Have that gel. And then I want you to cool down for 2 miles. That's what I want you to do. Give yourself a minute. If you don't need the full minute, don't take the full minute. Get your breathing under control. Because remember, this isn't a race. It's just a run. So you shouldn't be completely out of control breathing. But take that minute to just relax and just shift from run to cool down. The pace doesn't have to change very much. But mentally, I just want you to think that you're not running 6 miles into 7 and 8. You're now just doing a 2-mile run. That's it. So you now are doing basically 3 different things. You're warming up 2 miles, 4-mile run, 2-mile cool down. Okay? And like I said, the pace doesn't need to change for the last 2 miles. Really, all you're doing is mentally saying, okay, I'm going to take a minute to just recover and shift into, I got 2 more miles to go to end this. That's it. It's just the 2 miles out of the run, as the 2 miles at the beginning was the 2 miles into the run. It's a little mental gymnastics, but sometimes what really helps is breaking the run down. And by doing that, you're building yourself up mentally. So that's what I would recommend. Give it a shot. Let me know how it goes. All right? But I will tell you this, we got something in common, because it happens to me too. It happens to all of us, if we're being honest. So give it a try, break it down, build yourself up, and I think we're going to find something good. All right? So thank you, Noah from Philly, for sending into the mailbag. And yes, we're going to be bringing the mailbag back each week. So now it's time for the Mindset Minute. That's right. Get excited. It's time to bring in Mindset Coach Extraordinaire from the Show Up Society, the one, the only, Coach Tammy Bennett.
Okay, today's Mindset Minute, I want you to put your hand on your heart, and I want you to say, I solemnly swear that whatever my pace may be today, on this day, with the given circumstances in my life, I am not going to be an asshole to myself about it. If it's slower than usual, I am not going to be an asshole to myself about it. I am here to listen to my body and to honor what my body needs and wants, and my mind. Sometimes my mind is tired and my pace might be a little slower because of it. But basically, I want you to honor wherever you are in this day and not be an asshole to yourself about it if the pace isn't what you normally would run. This may sound cheesy, it may sound corny, and I don't care, because it's good for you and it's going to help you.
As always, the Mindset Minute is probably the highlight of the entire episode. I mean, I can say it. I don't want any of you to say it, because I want you to tell me that I'm the highlight of the episode, even if I'm not. But let's be honest, that Mindset Minute is always great. So thank you, as always, to Coach Tammy Bennett of the Show Up Society. Her link will be in the show notes. You can check her out if you want to work with her. Check out her podcast, which is the Show Up Society podcast. She's got a great webpage, the whole thing, all that good stuff. It's all going to be in the show notes. And that's Finding Your Pace, episode 55 of Coach Bennett's podcast, as we're celebrating our year anniversary by thanking all of you for being with us. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing the podcast. If you're going to rate and review it, you get extra thanks, because that means the world. So please rate and review the podcast wherever you are listening to the podcast. And I'm going to be heading down to the U.S. Olympic Trials in Eugene, Oregon for the next 10 days or so. So I'll be reporting from there. Make sure you're checking me out, whether it's on Instagram or Threads or TikTok or even on here, Substack, the newsletter. Most of the stuff's going to be coming from the U.S. Olympic Trials, which I'm super excited about. It's maybe my favorite track meet for a lot of different reasons, which I'll get into on episode 56. So until then, take care of yourself, take care of each other, and I'll meet you on your next starting line. Thank you so much for listening to Coach Bennett's podcast today. And if you're not already following or subscribed to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening, well, I really wish you would because it helps a lot. Also, check out the show notes because you'll find a link to Coach Bennett's newsletter, as well as all the social media sites that I'm on. Places like Threads and Facebook and Instagram and Mastodon and YouTube, and even the artist formerly known as Twitter. Whatever that dumpster fire is called today, you'll find a link to it because I'm on there. Thank you so much again for listening, and until next time, take care of yourself.